College football nerds here talking Utah and Florida. And y'all, that means that it is college football season, not preview off-season team discussion. And we are here for it. I got Josh with me. He's getting nerdy with me as well. And look, this is a super interesting game, and we're kicking off the season with it. So that's one that we picked. Josh, I think that it's interesting looking at these two teams because Utah sort of found their stride after week 2 or 3, and that's kind of where Florida fell apart a little bit. And so there's a little bit of a dichotomy there. But just to start this discussion, because Florida fans might not be super familiar with Utah, and they might look at that San Diego State game or that BYU game and say, look, these guys are pushovers. They're losing to non-P5 teams, and they're coming into the swamp. Talk about how, Cam Rising stepping up there really changed the dynamics of that team, and maybe talk a little bit about the personnel that we're looking at this year, because it's a little bit different.
Right. So if you're unfamiliar with what happened last year, the Utah started the season with Charlie Brewer at quarterback. He was a transfer from Baylor. Brewer, just being honest, kind of sucked. And it took him a while to figure that out. They ended up dropping the BYU game, and they found Cam Rising in the San Diego State game, but they didn't find him in time to actually pull off a W. But for the rest of the year, they really, really put things together. And they were, I would say, sort of defined as being a physical football team, which has been Whittingham's MO, but also being a team that would help other teams find ways to beat themselves. But they played good football, and they beat good football teams. I mean, they beat Oregon twice, first time 38-7, second time 38-10. Thumped Stanford 52-7. UCLA they beat 44-24, and that was a pretty good team last year at times. So it's really hard to say that they weren't a good team in terms of quality. Now, we dinged them a little bit when we talked top 15, top 25 rankings, as you must, because you have to accept the fact that they were a 3-loss team late in the year. But in terms of overall power rating quality, handicapping quality, they were a lot better than that. So you should, if you see that win-loss total, maybe put that out of your mind a little bit. I don't think that's really a fair indication of who you're going to face. The roster is actually really hard to get a grip on, in my view. I think these two teams are pretty similar, and we'll talk on that later when we turn to Florida. But on the defensive side of the ball in particular, there's a lot of new faces. I think, Florida fans are probably going to be familiar with Diabate, that transferred over from Florida, but there's also FCS All-American transfer at safety, transfers in the defensive line, combined with old and new guys. It's hard. We're not beat writers. I'm not at practice. It's really hard for me to honestly give you a good gauge of what the defense is going to exactly look at. But I do imagine it's going to be physical. And the pieces they brought in are pieces that would suggest that they're going to have a complete roster when everything's said and done. Offensively, great offensive line from last year. They lost several important pieces from that. But I think they still have a good offensive line roster. They bring back their quarterback. They bring back a 1,000-yard rusher. I don't know that they really had a great wide receiver per se. They lose their leading guy, who was Brenton Cox, but otherwise I'm not sure he was really, by the end of the year, was really that much of their dominant number one anyway. And so they have a lot of guys that could step into that role. And again, if you catch a theme from a lot of stuff I just said, it's really not all that different from Florida. It's just a matter of trying to evaluate quality.
Yeah, and talking about Florida, like the thing that I need to know, and the thing that I'm curious about, and something that I want you to touch on, is we're going to get into Napier in a second and what he brings to the table, and maybe this is how we segue into it. But Florida showed last year that they had the roster to compete with Bama, 2-point loss at home, drilled Tennessee, and that was a good Tennessee team. If Utah fans aren't familiar with that brand name that's struggled lately, that was a good Tennessee team last year. 1-score loss at Kentucky, there's no shame in that, and then the wheels just came off after the Vanderbilt game. You don't do that if you don't have a roster that can compete at a decent level. So I'm curious, Josh, and this might be something that we don't know yet, but something that I'd like for you to maybe touch on as either a point of optimism or a point of something to look for, is we look at 6 and 7 last year, And there's a lot of the same pieces there this year. Is it a situation where, sometimes you want to see massive roster turnover or something like that? Is this a situation where 6-7 might have been 9-3 with the current coaching staff now? And from that standpoint, we should be a little bit more positive about the roster that's actually on this team.
It really is the opposite situation what Utah had. If you look at what Florida did to end the year, I think you get a false impression of the roster that Napier inherited. Now, Napier has had a long path to stardom, but it's a pretty establishment. He was at Alabama for a while, was at Clemson before that, transitioned over, pre-stamps at Arizona State before he ends up at Louisiana, and then he did great things at Louisiana, and they were kind of known for being a physical football team. Even when they played Power 5 teams, they routinely took punches and delivered punches of their own, beating a Big 12 team while he was there. Kind of a shocker to open the year, though. I think Texas sort of got revenge. I think you're going to see a team that's going to be much improved. I don't think you're going to see the team from last year that was 122nd in the country in penalties per game, that was pretty undisciplined, that didn't, especially late in the year, like in that game versus Samford, really late in the game versus South Carolina and the games versus Samford, the lack of intensity, focus, energy on the defensive side of the ball was embarrassing. There's a reason Dan Mullen was fired after one bad year, quote unquote, and it's that he lost that roster in a year probably to an extent that I have never seen before. And I've seen some like Chiswick getting fired, after a couple of years, but it wasn't this like mid-season drop off a cliff sort of deal. But if you unpack that, and this is what Daniel was getting at, right? If you accept the fact that the coaching staff lost the players, that they did sort of quit, that they weren't playing disciplined football, you do have to admit those early games were the same players Utah's about to face. And I think if Napier is able to change the culture of that program, which may or may not be a tall task, we really will not know until this game's over, I think, where they stand. There's every reason to think that they could play at a higher level. And let's talk briefly about the roster. I mean, they lose, guys like Elam and Carter on defense. I mean, they're good players, but by Florida standards, I mean, there's no spikes there. There's not a guy that I think was really terrorizing opposing defenses. And some of the best players, in my view, they returned. So Brenton Cox, with a transfer from Georgia, played at a very high level last year. I think he can play even better this year. Ventrell Miller was really sort of the glue piece for their team at linebacker. They lose him the very beginning of the season. I think it really impacted the chemistry of the defense. Getting him back could be huge just from that perspective. And then, even at the second level, you get guys like Trey Dean that has a lot of experience. He's been a good player. There's a lot of reason to think that Florida can turn things around. The offensive side of the ball, I will say, is maybe the more interesting side. Anthony Richardson, if you followed us and you're a Florida fan, there are probably a few that have watched our channel, probably sort of gritting their teeth a little bit because they know we were not particularly positive on him to begin the year. But you have to understand, Mullen tried to make these pieces sort of fit in particular holes. And Richardson, as a quarterback, was not really ready to do the reads and checks Mullen needed. We saw that in their early games. People did not believe us. We took a lot of heat for it. But Mullen expects you to make reads, run, and pass. He has a complicated offense. And Richardson was really brilliant at creating, but you can't really create against a high-level team when the offense isn't designed to let you do that. And we realized it was going to be a problem, and when they faced Georgia, it was. And likewise, the receivers are all good. They're big, they're physical, but they're not really good at getting separation. And so this sort of short passing game thing that Mullen wanted to do just won't work. I think what's interesting to see is if Napier comes in with a more physical mindset, and if they play really what is just more like what Utah was last year, where they are a lot more heavy in leveraging Richardson's ability to run the ball as a design function of the offense. The fact that when you've got guys like Justin Shorter at wide receiver, that's a big, big dude, if you're not aware. He probably would play tight end most places, was 5-star guy for a reason due to his size. You can play physical football on the perimeter, and I think you're going to see the same Florida players play a probably different scheme, different brand of football. May not even really be Napier's brand of football, but Napier has a reputation for getting his guys to play physical and really molding a scheme around what he has to make the most of it. And I think you could see some serious improvement. I mean, obviously not 6-7, but even more so, really serious improvement from Florida this year.
All right, so one thing that I want to note before we get into some of this other discussion is that Utah has not played, and Utah fans might get mad about this, but this is just fact. They haven't played. This team hasn't played in a stadium with a crowd that is this bonkers, ever. Like the closest analog would be at Oregon, and I don't think they've played there because of COVID and some weirdness since 2017. Washington is another one that gets pretty good. That's a great stadium. It's on my bucket list, but it ain't at Florida. And Ben Hill Griffin is going to be jumping. And if you go back and watch the highlights of that Alabama game, it absolutely affected that team. It absolutely affected Bryce Young, those wide receivers, that chemistry. So I think that is something, if we're thinking about when we're going to make a pick later in the game or later in this discussion, that's one thing that's going to stick with me a little bit is that crowd. It might be a bit of a shock to Utah. But here's something I want to do because I think it'll be kind of fun. I'm going to give you a chance to discuss both teams since there's some question marks about both these teams, and this is a really hard game to pick. I think Vegas has got it opened at 1.5. Utah laying 1.5, and now it's to 2.5, but it's still kind of in that pick'em territory. When you're watching this game, Josh, and there's question marks in your mind about the rosters and about the cohesiveness and the ability to execute for both of these teams. Let's do Utah first. When you see Utah in this game, you know they're going to be in trouble if Florida is able to do what?
I think if Florida is able to get separation at the receiver position. So when we did the Ohio State-Utah game, it's worth noting that we both realized that game was going to be really close. I mean, Daniel actually picked Utah to win the game outright, 34-20. I picked Ohio State, 33-30, but we both knew it was a nightmare matchup for both teams, really. Utah had problems. They'd handled UCLA well, but UCLA was more of a scramble quarterback situation. What they'd struggled with was teams that really genuinely threw the ball well. And they had, issues due to injury at the defensive back position where you end up having a converted running back playing corner, and Jackson Smith and Jigba. I'm hoping Ohio State fans don't listen to this, but if you will, there's a little bit where he's being overhyped out of that game, I think, because Utah was a mash unit. And I'd be clear, I think he's a phenomenally good receiver. I just think there's some Ohio State fans that think he's going to have 200 yards a game. Don't think that's probably realistic, and I don't think it's really a fair reflection of where Utah was. But if Florida, with their receiving core that I think could take a step forward, but they're still not going to be first-round draft pick receivers. I think you're just looking for consistent production. But if those guys are able to get separation on Utah, then you've got a problem. And Utah is going to want to try to contain Anthony Richardson and make him throw down the field. But if Florida can get open to where Richardson has the ability to throw the ball to a first read or maybe a second read, this game is going to get a lot harder for Utah. And, the question marks for me coming off last year with Utah is their secondary better? Was that sort of a glaring weakness? And if it is, and it's something Florida can exploit, I think Utah's ability to play the kind of game they want to play is going to fall apart. And then all of a sudden you got to back guys out of the box and they can really run Richardson and things may get out of hand a little bit.
And Utah fans, we flagged this before really talking about injuries and having to play running backs in the Rose Bowl. In our preview, we talked about, we went back and checked the numbers. There were I think they played 4 teams that had over 8 yards an attempt in passing or something like that, and all 4 of those teams shredded their defense. So they legitimately had issues with teams that could throw the ball. Now, Oregon couldn't, and that really messed with them. I'll go a little bit different, Josh, and say that Utah is in trouble if the perception of the brand, Pac-12 versus SEC, that the SEC is going to be more physical, that the SEC is going to be faster. We haven't seen that with Utah, and I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case in this game. But if those, let's say, caricatures hold up, if that holds up in this game and Florida's able to out physical Utah, because I think that's where Utah wins this game. If they win it, is being able to match or be more physical than Florida. If Florida is the more physical team, I think that signals some pretty scary situations for Utah, because that's their bread and butter. That's how they beat Oregon twice, beat the crap out of them, and they're going to need that to win this game. But give me your, if we're looking mid third quarter and we're saying, oh, Florida's in trouble, that means Utah is doing what?
It's going to be running the football. It's an easy answer to the question. Maybe you'll try to think up something more clever about what Florida is going to do on offense, but where Florida would be on offense, I guess. But if Utah can run the football, be it the quarterback or the running back, they're going to be able to play their game of football, and they're going to be comfortable doing so. I mean, Napier really prides his teams on being able to go blow for blow with the other team, and when they lost, for example, to Texas, the thing that, if you have that mindset and you're not able to win the line of scrimmage, things tend to go poorly for you. I mean, we frequently see that in the SEC. Had a big boy come down and be head coach at Arkansas, decide that he was going to have a huge offensive line and run it down people's throats. And when he played teams that were a lot more talented than him and he couldn't do it, it did not go well for Bielema. And I think Utah would be in the same boat if they can't run well. But if they can run well, if they can actually bully Florida around on the line of scrimmage a little bit, and then they can play the type of football they want to play, which is honestly, a very SEC style of football. If you want to talk just average scheme style, whatever, they're going to be in their comfort zone. And I think from a personnel standpoint, look, we talked a little bit about the back seven at Florida. There's a lot of pieces that could be there. You guys like Kimber, the transfer. There's a lot of things that could be at play. Torrance is a good safety. I think there's reasons to think the back seven at Florida is going to be good. But I have a lot more questions about the front. And Brenton Cox may be a really good pass rusher, but outside edge guys and linebackers are really only as good as your defensive line's ability to eat blocks. And if they can't eat blocks, then size tends to take over and nothing else really matters. So to me, it's really a simple key to Utah if you want to be successful in this game, and that's run the damn ball, right?
And I think that I agree with you there, because being able to run the ball sort of reflects a lot of things. It reflects that physicality thing that we're talking about. It also, like, Florida fans might know about Cam Rising's story and kind of taking over, but they may not know about Tavian Thomas. And Tavian Thomas had a great year last year. He's a 1,000-yard running back. There's not a ton of those, coming back this year. And he had one carry in 2 games, across 2 games, Washington State and San Diego State, and still managed to be a 1,000-yard back last year. Well over five yards a carry. He doesn't get involved much in the passing game, but if he's, able to do what he was able to do a lot of times last year, then I do think Florida's in trouble, because, the flip side of that too is, they got a quarterback that can run the ball too. He had a 500-yard season last year. So I agree with you. I think that's a good point. I also think that if Anthony Richardson is limited to that athleticism and just running the ball, I think Florida's also in trouble. I actually think he's going to show a pretty big step in development in throwing the ball this year. I think a lot of what was going on last year was scheme related, was how Dan Mullen uses quarterbacks related, that really didn't take advantage of him. But if he can't throw the ball against a defense that, to really take advantage of them, you got to be able to, I think Florida's going to be in trouble. But with that, segueing into our prediction for this game, we got to do it. We have a model that we bring out in week 4. We don't bring it out in week 1 because there is no data, and we are not ESPN. FPI is stupid. Josh, give me your prediction for this game.
Like you said, it's difficult. We try to be pretty data-driven. I'm not going to pretend like doing predictions in week 1 isn't a little bit of a blind guess, especially with the transfer era. I'm going to pick Florida slightly. I'll say Florida 31, Utah 28. my confidence level there is non-existent, having not really seen the teams play this year. It's more to do with how much of a step forward I think Florida can take potentially. Um, it won't surprise me at all if Utah wins. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Utah wins big. I really don't know what to expect because I'm not sure where the bounce back is. And I think a lot of it, like you said, is really does hinge around what they can get from Anthony Richardson in terms of where their ceiling as a program is. And I think everybody knows that. I was probably the most vocal critic of Richardson early last year. And I want to clarify something with that. My point was always not that Richardson is a bad quarterback. It's that Richardson was not ready. And I thought he really wasn't ready from what I saw on tape. I don't think I was wrong. And a lot of it had to do with coaching and scheme and everything else. But none of that really matters. I just knew that if they switched to Richardson with where he was at developmentally and the scheme they were in, he was not going to be in a position to be successful, and he would not be overly successful. And he really wasn't. I think the last year probably is going to do wonders for him. I am really excited to see where he ends up, and I'm really honestly more excited to see what Florida does with him and how they use his talents, maybe leverage his talents in a better way. Because as much as Mullen was known for having running quarterbacks, for some strange reason, he never really leaned on that with Richardson in a way that I think Florida probably should. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to have Florida a slight edge. Call it an optimistic take for Florida. But definitely my confidence scale 1 to 10, I'm not going higher than a 3 on this.
Josh, real quick, give me a score if this was on a neutral site versus being at Florida.
I'd probably pick Utah on a neutral site. It'd probably be like 30-27 Utah. But I do agree with you. And look, it's not a shot on the Pac-12. It's just the Swamp is a legendarily difficult place to play for a reason. You're playing in September, and with a team I think it's really messed with a lot of teams, I want to say, coming out of COVID, when they do go play in a hugely hostile stadium, because even some of your juniors on a football team have not played in a really hostile environment before. And I felt like last year we saw a lot of teams shell-shocked as a result of that. Week 1, coming off, still everybody's, I think, not quite as battle-hardened as they should be. I do think that might be worth a touchdown in this game.
I agree. And I've got Florida 24-20, and I'm giving them 7 points on the home crowd. I think it's that big a deal, and I think COVID still has that effect, like you said. And it's not a shot at the Pac-12 because Oregon gets crazy. Washington can get, in a good year, when Washington's a 10-win team, it gets loud. Like, there are good places to play in the Pac-12. So it's not a shot at them. It's just that these teams aren't well traveled, and the schedule fell in a certain way that Utah's not going on the road at Oregon a lot. And even by SEC standards, the Swamp is on another level. So if people want to have a comparison, go watch. There's a video from Harris Highlights that's called "The Most Electric Moment in College Football History," and it's the opening 3 plays of a whiteout game at Beaver Stadium, Penn State versus Michigan. Florida gets that loud. So go watch that video. That's what it's going to be like for at least 2 quarters in this game, and then every major play after that. So I think that also what we saw last year, Florida might be a team that's really hard to beat early. So I've got 24-20, and 7 of that is home field. I don't know that I'm writing off Utah, and that's maybe an interesting discussion. Is there still a pretty solid path to the playoffs for Utah if they drop this game? Like, I'm not going to look down on them for this. I'm giving them a lot of points for going on the road to play Florida, and frankly, Florida a lot of points for scheduling them too. Just real quick because it's running long, but do you see a path to the playoffs if Utah happens to drop this game?
Yeah, I do. I mean, when you talk playoff path, it always is mostly dependent upon what other conferences do, honestly, more than anything. But I think a week 1 loss is going to be the most forgivable, out of conference especially. You don't want to punish someone too much for playing tough out of conference games. And again, you talk about the noise factor, and it's because Florida's got a brand new coach. No one knows what it's going to look like. Their fans are excited. Week 1, it's going to be a big game and a bit weird. But you run the table the rest of the way. I think any conference is going to be hard pressed to get their 12-1 champion left out of the playoffs. So I don't. It's definitely not in and of itself going to be that fatal to anything.
All right, y'all. You got 2 pieces of homework this week. Actually, I'm going to give you 3. 1, give me your score in the comments, and we're going to mix it up with you down there. 2, Google goes sleepy on us in the offseason. They forget that we exist. So make sure that you've got that little notification bell hit, because I know y'all are already subscribed. Florida fans, Utah fans, y'all love us. If you're not, obviously there's a red button you need to hit too. And finally, check out some of our team previews. We also did a 4-part series in the offseason about NIL and transfers, and that's probably some of the best content we've ever done. So if you want more from us, you can check that out in either on our YouTube channel, or we've got a podcast version if you want to just listen to it in all one shot. We got that as well. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.